Senator from North Carolina.
Well, welcome back, Madam President.
Thank you.
Thank you for giving me an opportunity to talk about the bill that we'll have before us in about an hour and a half. I have to stand here and rise in opposition to the For the People Act. I think you could appropriately title it the Fool the People Act. We're going to be voting on it later today, but it would dramatically alter election laws across our country. I've been in the Senate for 6.5 years, and this ranks up there as one of the worst bills that I've seen come before this body. I know my friends on the other side of the aisle like to talk about it as being essential for protecting democracy, but in the face of text that could be patently unconstitutional and taking away the rights of states to administer their elections, I find it hard to believe that it's anything but a motivated attempt to federalize the nation's election system. The For the People Act would achieve it through a number of, I think, overreaches. I'm only going to talk about a few. For one, voter ID. The For the People Act would essentially render null voter ID laws across this country. Instead of an ID, which most of us have, and virtually I think every citizen should have, you'd simply just sign an affidavit to say you are who you say you are. I've heard the Georgia law, for example, brought up as providing egregious limits or obstacles to proving who you say you are. In a hearing a month or so ago, we had an official from Georgia in a Judiciary Committee. I said, could you explain to me what the challenge is? So if somebody gets an absentee ballot, like you do in North Carolina, we have no excuse absentee balloting. We've had it for years. I've supported it. I've voted that way several times. We had people say that it was just an egregious imposition to note a 10 or 12 character driver's license or government ID number on the affidavit. That's all it is. You don't have to send a copy of it. You just simply have to write a number down. So if you have an ink pen, I guess you could argue if you don't have a writing instrument, then maybe that's an overreach or an imposition on a voter. I don't think it is. And even in the Georgia law that has been castigated by some of my friends on the other side of the aisle, they even provide for people who want to vote who may not have a government-issued ID, other documents that could be used in their place. We've talked about hundreds of bills that have been filed by Republican legislators without a single Democrat vote that are like the Georgia bill that I just described, which I think is arguably a fair bill. But most of these bills are things that Democrat and Republicans should be able to agree on. You should cleanse your voter rolls. You should make sure that people who have died, people who could be registered in one or more states, are cleared from the voter rolls just to prevent fraud and abuse, not necessarily perpetrated by any one party, but just because the data could be out of date. And, you know, back on voter ID, I find it remarkable that we have a measure before us that we're going to be voting on today, a simple ID requirement that 80% of Americans just this week in a poll said they think is reasonable. Now, you have to also understand that we make accommodations if you don't have an ID. In North Carolina, we moved heaven and earth to make sure you need a government-issued ID, I believe, to be able to move through society, to get a hotel room, to get on an airplane. I had surgery a couple of months ago. I had to present an ID to get admitted into the hospital. I think we're disenfranchising people from the rest of society by not at least making sure that they can identify who they are. There's no argument. You can't get on a plane without an ID. You can't travel internationally without an ID. You can't get health care without an ID. But for some reason, to do something, to exercise our right and our privilege to vote, we think that we don't need an ID. I also worry about a provision in this bill that would allow nationwide ballot harvesting. There are only a couple of states that actually allow ballot harvesting. What does that mean? You have a worker coming up, going door to door, and encouraging somebody to vote. It may be somebody that doesn't want to vote, but now you're up there to capture their ballot and bring bunches of ballots to the polls. Ballot harvesting is legal in some states. I know California. It's not legal in our state. In fact, there was a Republican candidate who ultimately withdrew himself after winning a race after there were a couple of hundred ballots that were supposedly harvested. I don't think he knew about it, but there was a campaign operative that did it, and it cost him an election. And I'll tell you the one thing that I really do believe if the Founding Fathers were here in this chamber today, they would really be scratching their heads. And it's the idea of taxpayer-funded elections. Make no mistake about it. Federal, state, and local dollars are used to make sure that we have election machines, that we have poll workers, that we have access, and we can always improve access to the polls. But in this bill, they're saying, and in people in North Carolina, if you were paying attention last year, my race was all in with me and my opponent, $296 million. There were a lot of ads on TV. I had my friends call me up screaming at the TV when they were mean to me, and I'm sure I had my opponent, who is a friend of mine, say the same thing. But now what we're going to do, if we were to pass this bill, is say Thom Tillis supporters are going to have money spent and direct it to my opponent to try and beat me, and vice versa. Millions and millions of dollars. And in states like North Carolina, not only North Carolina taxpayers, but taxpayers from across this country will see their taxpayer dollars come to North Carolina to influence an outcome in a campaign that could be 1,000 miles away. That is, I think, taking taxpayer dollars and then spending them on something that they are personally opposed to, offended by, is something that I don't think the Founding Fathers would have ever envisioned as being appropriate for this great nation. So, ladies and gentlemen, today at about 5:30, I think a little after, the For the People, or as I said, the Fool the People Act is going to be before us, and it's going to fail. We know it. Senator Schumer knows it. So why are we doing it? Are we doing it for messaging points? Are there some far left liberals that just want the vote on the floor, knowing full well it's not going to pass? Have we actually tried to do any work to figure out what role the federal government should play in actually improving election outcomes that ultimately need to be administered by the state? No, that hasn't happened. So today we're going to come on the floor. This measure is not going to move forward. And somebody maybe is fooling, I don't know, far left groups just to say we tried, but they didn't try. Because if they tried, they'd have reached across the other aisle and tried to figure out something that made sense that could pass with 60 votes. So, Mr. President, the For the People Act is far afield from what our Founding Fathers envisioned. Can we improve our election processes across this country? Yes. But I would prefer to have the 50 laboratories of democracy figure out how to improve it and have other states implement it, perhaps even other states in the Northeast that have far fewer voting days than we do in North Carolina. They could learn from that. Maybe we should create standards and incentives for that sort of stuff, but not a federal takeover of the elections in this country. And for that reason, I'll be opposing the For the People Act. Thank you, Mr. President.